War is rarely about what it claims to be. It speaks of security, of defense, of justice. But beneath those words, something colder exists: power. The tension between the United States and Iran is not just conflict, it is a game of positioning. When Donald Trump applied maximum pressure, it was not only about weakening Iran, it was about forcing a reaction, shaping the board. And Iran did not collapse. It adapted. It resisted. Machiavelli once wrote that war is never avoided, only delayed. But he also warned, if power is used without precision, it begins to weaken itself. And in this silent game between nations, both sides are playing, but not always wisely.
Niccolo Machiavelli believed that a ruler must appear strong, even when choosing restraint, because perception shapes reality. When Donald Trump spoke about Iran, his words carried weight beyond policy, sharp, direct, and designed to be heard not just by Iran, but by the entire world. Strength was not only exercised, it was displayed, with decisions made in public view and each move sending a signal. Iran, however, responded differently, less loud, more measured, issuing controlled statements and taking actions that were rarely rushed, building a different kind of performance rooted not in volume, but in endurance. Both sides were constantly communicating, not always through direct words, but through meaningful actions. A military movement near a border, a pause, everything watched, nothing isolated. Machiavelli understood this dynamic deeply. Rulers are judged not only by what they do, but by how their actions are perceived. Too much aggression creates fear but invites resistance. Too much silence creates doubt but invites challenge. The balance, then, is delicate. Show strength without recklessness, show restraint without weakness. This is the theater both nations operate within, a space where every move must serve two purposes: to act and to be seen acting. Because power in its purest form is not just about control, but about shaping how others understand that control. And sometimes the image of power becomes as important as power itself.
Niccolo Machiavelli observed that pressure, when applied over time, begins to change its nature. At first, it feels like force, clear and direct. When Donald Trump introduced economic sanctions against Iran, the intention appeared simple: limit resources, reflecting a Machiavellian idea that if you must act against an opponent, do it in a way that weakens them quickly. But time altered the outcome, because prolonged pressure teaches adaptation. Iran did not collapse under this force. It adjusted, economically, politically, and strategically, turning restrictions into part of its environment, where resilience slowly began to form. Machiavelli warned of this, believing that harm, if necessary, should be delivered swiftly and decisively, because prolonged pressure allows the opponent to recover, to learn, and to resist more effectively. This is where the pattern shifts. What was meant to weaken begins to strengthen, not openly, but quietly. Iran developed alternative systems, new alliances, and different pathways to sustain itself. The pressure remained, but so did the response, and over time the conflict transformed into a cycle: pressure, adaptation, pressure again, where each side learns and adjusts continuously. Machiavelli understood that repeated conflict without resolution creates something dangerous: familiarity. When an opponent becomes familiar with pressure, they begin to lose fear, and when fear fades, control becomes harder to maintain. This reveals the deeper layer of tension: not just action and reaction, but evolution, a system where both sides continue, yet neither fully dominates. And in that space, power does not disappear, it quietly reshapes itself.
Niccolo Machiavelli understood that power lives inside perception. A ruler does not only control territory, he shapes how others feel about his strength. War is often imagined as force, but before any of that begins, something quieter is already at work: the mind. Fear becomes a tool, uncertainty becomes a weapon, and control begins long before action. When the United States speaks with authority, it is not only delivering a message, it is creating an image of reach, capability, and consequence, an image meant to be believed, because belief shapes behavior. If the opponent believes you are capable, they hesitate. If they believe you are unpredictable, they become cautious. This is psychological power. Iran understands this as well, often responding not with equal force, but with calculated signals, enough to show strength, but not enough to trigger full escalation, creating a constant state of tension and uncertainty. Machiavelli believed that a ruler must sometimes be feared but not hated, because fear creates control, while hatred creates rebellion, and this balance becomes visible here. Too much aggression from the United States risks creating global resistance, while too much submission from Iran risks losing internal and external credibility. So both sides operate carefully, maintaining an image and shaping reactions. Because the real battle is not always physical, it is psychological. Each side watches the other, not just for action, but for intention. What will they do next? How far will they go? And in that space of unanswered questions, power exists not in certainty, but in controlled doubt, because the one who shapes perception often shapes the outcome.
Niccolo Machiavelli warned that conflict should not be stretched without purpose, because time changes everything. It softens fear and reveals patterns, and this is where the first mistake appears: prolonged tension. The strategy of pressure, especially from the United States, continues over time. Sanctions remain, warnings repeat, and signals become familiar, and familiarity reduces impact, as what once felt threatening becomes expected. Machiavelli believed that if harm must be done, it should be swift and decisive, not repeated endlessly, because repetition weakens intensity. The second mistake is overexposure. When actions are constantly announced and strategies become predictable, something critical is lost: uncertainty. And without uncertainty, psychological power begins to fade, as a predictable opponent is easier to manage. Iran, too, moves against this principle at times. Its responses, though measured, can become patterned, with certain reactions repeating and certain limits becoming visible, and once those limits are seen, they can be tested. Machiavelli understood the importance of unpredictability, believing a ruler should never allow others to fully understand his boundaries, because once those boundaries are clear, control begins to slip. The third mistake is hesitation without resolution. Moments appear where decisions could shift the balance, but they pass. Neither side fully commits nor fully withdraws, and so the tension remains, not ending, not evolving, just continuing. Machiavelli warned that indecision creates vulnerability because it signals uncertainty, and uncertainty invites pressure. These mistakes are not loud, they do not appear as failures, but over time they quietly reshape the balance, because power is not only lost in defeat, it is also lost in repetition, in predictability, and in delay. And when these patterns settle in, even strong positions begin to weaken. Niccolo Machiavelli observed that power does not always move loudly. Sometimes it waits. While the world watches statements and sanctions, Iran often operates in a quieter space, not rushing or reacting impulsively, but adjusting. Machiavelli understood the value of patience. A ruler who cannot win immediately must not collapse, he must endure, because time itself can become an ally. This is where Iran's strategy begins to take shape. Pressure arrives, economic, political, military, but instead of breaking, it bends. New systems are built, alternative paths are explored, and alliances shift, not always visible or announced, but present. Machiavelli believed that indirect power can sometimes be stronger than direct confrontation because it avoids unnecessary damage while still expanding influence. Iran often avoids full-scale escalation, responding within limits, enough to signal strength, but not enough to invite total destruction, creating a controlled tension, a space where conflict exists but remains contained. Within that space, something important happens. Time passes, and time changes the balance. Opponents grow tired, strategies evolve, and focus shifts, allowing patience itself to become a form of pressure. Yet even this approach carries risk. Machiavelli warned that too much caution can be mistaken for weakness. If strength is not shown clearly at the right moment, influence begins to fade.
The balance then becomes delicate. Wait, but not too long. Act, but not too strongly. This is the silent strategy, not built on dominance, but on survival, adaptation, and quiet persistence. Because sometimes power is not about winning quickly, but about remaining when others expect collapse, and in that endurance, a different kind of control begins to form.
Niccolo Machiavelli understood that there comes a moment when strength begins to reveal something deeper, not weakness, but limitations. When Donald Trump applied continuous pressure, it created a clear image of dominance, decisive, uncompromising, and visible. But over time, something subtle began to shift. What is repeated becomes familiar, and what becomes familiar loses its edge. This is not failure, it is transformation, where the nature of power changes when it is constantly seen. Its sharpness softens, its unpredictability fades, and gradually the reaction it once controlled begins to stabilize. Machiavelli observed that power must move between visibility and silence, because when it remains in one state for too long, it reveals itself. And once something is revealed, it can be understood. And once it is understood, it can be managed. This is the quiet realization, not about right or wrong, but about rhythm. Power that speaks too often teaches others how to listen without fear, and power that acts too frequently teaches others how to expect it, and expectation creates calm, even in conflict. So the question is not what was done, but what became visible through it. Because in the end, power is not only measured by force, but by how long it remains unpredictable. And once unpredictability fades, control begins to shift, not loudly, but quietly. Niccolo Machiavelli once suggested something unsettling. War is not always meant to end quickly. Sometimes it continues, not because it cannot be stopped, but because it serves a purpose. When conflict stretches over time, it begins to change those within it, not just their strategies, but their very nature. The tension between the United States and Iran has moved through years of pressure, response, and adjustment, and within that cycle, something deeper has formed: familiarity. Each side begins to understand the other, their limits, their patterns, their thresholds, and with that understanding comes adaptation. Machiavelli warned that prolonged conflict carries a hidden cost. It does not only test strength, it reshapes it. Fear becomes routine, tension becomes normal, resistance becomes expected, and when these become normal, they lose their power. This is the quiet shift, not always visible from the outside, but deeply present. The conflict continues, but its meaning changes. No longer a question of immediate victory, but of endurance, positioning, and waiting. And within that waiting, power evolves. Not always stronger, not always weaker, but different. More calculated, more aware, more restrained. This may be the closest reflection of Machiavelli's prediction, that the greatest danger is not war itself, but the way it transforms those who remain within it. Because over time, conflict stops being an event and becomes a system, one that continues not because it must, but because it has learned how to exist.